smoke was moving through the stairwell. People were coming down by the hundreds. Some were coughing, some were crying. Others simply followed the person in front of them because nobody really knew what was happening above. And moving in the opposite direction were firefighters, going up. In the middle of all of it was a 62-year-old man in a business suit. No helmet, no breathing apparatus, just a bullhorn. He kept telling people to stay together. Keep moving, don't stop. When fear began spreading through the staircase, he did something even stranger. He started to sing. Not because the danger had passed, but because thousands of people still had to get out. The man himself had a path to safety. He could have followed everyone else down those stairs instead. 36 years earlier, Rick Rescorla was a young lieutenant walking into a very different kind of danger. Vietnam, 1965. And before that war was over, the men around him would learn something about Rick Rescorla. When everyone else wanted out, Rescorla had a habit of going the other way. Rick Rescorla arrived in Vietnam in September 1965 as a platoon leader in Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. He was young, lean, physically relentless, and about to enter the first major confrontation between American forces and the North Vietnamese Army. But there was something unusual about the American officer stepping into that jungle. He wasn't American. Not yet. Cyril Richard Rescorla had grown up in Hale, a small town on the coast of Cornwall, England. In 1957, he joined the British Army and became a paratrooper. He served in Cyprus and Northern Rhodesia. After leaving the Army, he joined the Northern Rhodesia Police. It was there that his path crossed with an American named Dan Hill. Hill and Rescorla became close friends. Both were intensely interested in military history, survival, physical conditioning, and the growing Cold War struggle against communism. Hill eventually convinced Rescorla that the next major fight was likely to happen in Southeast Asia. So in 1963, Rescorla did something remarkable. He moved to the United States and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He trained at Fort Dix, attended officer candidate school and airborne training at Fort Benning, and by 1965, he had been assigned to the 7th Cavalry. The American citizenship would come later. Vietnam came first. And almost immediately, Rescorla developed a reputation. His soldiers called him hardcore. The nickname wasn't just about physical toughness. Rescorla could be demanding, aggressive, and completely confident when things were going badly. But the same men also remembered his humor and his concern for them. Years later, his commander Hal Moore would describe him as the best platoon leader I ever saw. That reputation was about to be tested, because in November 1965, the 7th Cavalry entered the Ia Drang Valley, and what happened there would follow Rescorla for the rest of his life. The first major fight centered on a small clearing known as Landing Zone X-Ray. On November 14, Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry landed there and quickly found itself fighting a much larger North Vietnamese force. The battle became exactly the kind of helicopter war the United States was only beginning to understand. Men arrived in waves, artillery crashed into the surrounding jungle, helicopters flew repeatedly into a landing zone under fire. American soldiers fought at distances so close that the advantages of air power and artillery could become difficult to use. As darkness approached, reinforcements were needed. That evening, elements of Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry arrived at X-Ray. Rick Rescorla was among them. He and his men dug in. The night did not become quiet. North Vietnamese troops probed the American perimeter. Everyone understood that another major attack could come before morning, and this is where one of Rescorla's strangest habits became useful. He sang old songs from Cornwall, military songs, anything that could keep frightened, exhausted men connected to one another. It wasn't entertainment, it was control. A soldier listening to his lieutenant sing in the darkness could hear something beneath the words. Their officer wasn't panicking, so perhaps they didn't need to panic either. The next morning, Rescorla moved through the battlefield looking for American dead and wounded. The fighting around X-Ray had been brutal, and the battle wasn't finished. The next major disaster would happen only a short distance away, Landing Zone Albany. On November 17, a column from the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry was moving through the jungle toward Albany when North Vietnamese troops struck. This was not the same kind of fight the Americans had just survived at X-Ray. There was no neatly defined defensive perimeter at the beginning. Units became separated. Command elements became isolated. American and North Vietnamese soldiers were suddenly fighting at extremely close range. The column was torn apart. Rescorla's Bravo Company was called back into the fight. Getting there was itself dangerous. According to later accounts, enemy fire prevented most helicopters from landing. Only 2 managed to get through. As the helicopter carrying Rescorla approached, the pilot was wounded and began lifting away again. Rescorla and his men jumped the remaining distance to the ground. Then they moved toward the trapped Americans. The men inside the Albany perimeter had spent hours watching their battalion being ripped apart. They needed ammunition, they needed reinforcements, they needed evidence that someone was actually coming, and then Rick Rescorla appeared. Not quietly. Accounts from soldiers there describe him entering the shattered perimeter displaying almost absurd confidence, smiling, shouting, acting as if the arrival of his platoon had suddenly shifted the advantage to the Americans. It hadn't, not numerically, not yet. But morale is not mathematics. The men already inside Albany could hear Rescorla's troops. They could hear yelling. They could hear confidence. And for exhausted soldiers who had been fighting simply to remain alive, that mattered. Rescorla survived Ia Drang. Many did not. The fighting left hundreds of American casualties across the valley, and the experience remained with him long after Vietnam. He received decorations that included the Silver Star, Bronze Star Awards, the Purple Heart, and the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. But Rick Rescorla did not enjoy being called a hero. And that brings us to one of the strangest details in this entire story, because millions of people connected with We Were Soldiers have probably seen Rick Rescorla, they just don't know it. In 1992, Hal Moore and journalist Joseph Galloway published We Were Soldiers Once and Young. It told the story of Ia Drang. The book would eventually become the basis for the 2002 movie We Were Soldiers. And on the cover of the book was a combat photograph. A young officer, rifle in hand. Exhausted, dirty, standing in Vietnam. That soldier was Rick Rescorla. But when the story reached Hollywood, Rescorla himself was not portrayed in the film. It is almost perfect historical irony. The man whose face became part of the identity of the book became one of the men the movie left out. Rescorla probably would not have objected. When he received the finished book and discovered himself on the cover, he reportedly put it aside. He didn't want his medals displayed in his house. He avoided many veteran reunions. And when he learned that Hollywood was making a movie about Ia Drang, he told his wife that he did not intend to watch it. His explanation was simple. The real heroes are dead. Rescorla wanted distance from the war, but the war had taught him something he never left behind. When people are frightened, preparation matters. When communication fails, leadership matters. And when a group has to move quickly, it is already too late to begin teaching them what to do. Those lessons would become important again, just not in Vietnam. Rescorla eventually left active duty, although he continued serving in the Army Reserve and ultimately reached the rank of colonel. Using the GI Bill, he pursued higher education, studied law, taught criminal justice, and eventually moved into corporate security. In 1985, he joined Dean Witter and moved to New Jersey. His workplace was in Manhattan, at the World Trade Center. His office would eventually sit on the 44th floor of the South Tower. After Dean Witter merged with Morgan Stanley, the company became the largest corporate tenant in the complex, occupying more than 20 floors of the tower and additional space nearby. For most people, those offices represented prestige. For Rescorla, they presented a security problem. After the 1988 destruction of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, he became increasingly concerned about terrorism and the vulnerability of prominent American targets. Around 1990, he called his old friend Dan Hill, the same man he had known before joining the U.S. Army. Hill had accumulated experience and knowledge in counterterrorism. Rescorla wanted him to look at the World Trade Center from a different perspective, not as someone trying to protect it, as someone trying to attack it. The two walked through the complex. Eventually, they reached the underground parking garage. And what Hill saw bothered him. A vehicle could enter. Structural elements were accessible. According to Hill's later account, a truck filled with explosives seemed like an obvious way to attack the building from below. Rescorla brought his concerns to the Port Authority. Hill later remembered the response as dismissive. The Port Authority, for its part, later maintained that security reflected the threats known at the time, and compared favorably with other New York office buildings. Nothing happened for a while. Then came February 26, 1993. A truck entered the underground garage beneath the World Trade Center. Inside was a bomb. At 12:10 in the afternoon, it exploded. The blast tore through several levels beneath the complex. Smoke moved upward. Electricity failed in parts of the buildings. People inside faced a long, confused evacuation. For Rick Rescorla, there was another realization. The scenario he and Hill had worried about was no longer theoretical. A truck bomb had been driven into the garage beneath the World Trade Center, and terrorists had demonstrated that the towers were a target. Rescorla helped lead Dean Witter's employees out during the 1993 attack. Then he began thinking about the next one. Because he did not believe the story had ended, his conclusion was that the company should leave the World Trade Center entirely, move operations out of Manhattan, spread people through lower buildings where a single attack could not trap thousands of employees in 2 towers. But leases and business realities made that difficult. The company remained, so Rescorla changed the problem. If he could not move the people away from the risk, he would prepare the people to survive it. Rescorla developed an evacuation system, and he made employees practice it again and again. These were not symbolic drills where people listened to an announcement and returned to work. Employees physically moved toward staircases. There was an order. There was a chain of command. People learned where to go. They learned how to move. They learned not to improvise. In one documented version of the plan, employees would move down in pairs, floor by floor, forming an organized flow into the stairwells. Rescorla insisted on regular rehearsals. Some employees complained. They were bankers, traders, executives, and office workers. Their time was valuable. Walking dozens of floors down a staircase because the security director imagined another disaster could feel excessive. Rescorla didn't care. He had seen what happened when frightened people encountered a crisis for the first time. In Vietnam, there had been no opportunity to pause an ambush and explain where everyone should go. Preparation happened before the shooting started, or it didn't happen at all, and there was another reason he refused to relax. Rescorla believed the terrorists might return. He and Hill continued studying possible attacks. According to later reporting, Rescorla even considered a future attack involving an aircraft. That did not mean he predicted the exact events of September 11th. He did not know a date. He did not know the specific plan, but he understood something much simpler. The World Trade Center was too important a symbol for its enemies to forget. So the drills continued. Year after year, employees walked the stairs. Security officers practiced controlling the flow. People learned an emergency procedure they hoped they would never need. Then, on a Tuesday morning in September 2001, they needed it. Rick Rescorla was 62 years old. He had survived war. He had survived cancer. He was married to Susan, and they were discussing retirement. They were supposed to fly to Italy the following day. On the morning of September 11th, Rescorla woke before dawn. He left his home in Morristown, New Jersey, caught the train into Manhattan, and reached his office before 7:30. Susan called him at 8:15. Everything was normal. 31 minutes later, it wasn't. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. From the South Tower, people could see smoke and fire pouring from the neighboring building. Nobody yet understood what had happened. Some assumed an accident. The 2 towers were separate structures, and an announcement inside the South Tower advised occupants that the building was secure and that they could remain where they were. Some people who had already begun leaving actually turned around. But one company was already moving. Morgan Stanley. Company security officials had begun evacuating more than 20 floors of employees. Rick Rescorla had heard enough. He ordered his people out. And suddenly, we are back where this story began. Smoke. Crowded stairs, firefighters moving upward, office workers moving down, and a 62-year-old man with a bullhorn standing in the middle of it. Now we know who he is. This is Rick Rescorla, the young lieutenant from Ia Drang, the man on the cover of We Were Soldiers once, and Young, the security officer who had worried about this building for years, the man whose employees had complained about walking down these stairs during drills. Now nobody was complaining. They knew where to go. Rescorla moved among them, issuing instructions. Keep to the right. Keep moving, don't panic. Firefighters and emergency personnel passed in the other direction, up. The employees continued down. Rescorla called Dan Hill in Florida. Hill could hear him directing people through the bullhorn, and he could hear something else. Rick Rescorla was singing again. 36 years earlier, he had sung in Vietnam while soldiers waited for another attack. Now he used the same tool inside an office tower. Different people, different battlefield, same problem: fear. Then, at 9:33 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. The situation changed instantly. This was no longer a precautionary evacuation from a neighboring emergency. The building Rescorla was evacuating had itself been hit. The aircraft tore into the tower between approximately the 77th and 85th floors. Fire and debris exploded outward. The tower shook. The path to safety was now measured in minutes. But Morgan Stanley employees were already moving. The decision had been made 17 minutes earlier, and those 17 minutes mattered. Rescorla continued working the staircases. Survivors later remembered him sweating heavily but refusing to stop. At moments he sang, at others he gave simple instructions: slow down, keep your pace, keep moving. The behavior may have looked almost impossibly calm, but this was not improvisation. This was the final version of a drill they had practiced for years, and gradually, floor after floor, Morgan Stanley emptied. Thousands made it out. The U.S. Army and the official Presidential Citizens Medal citation credit Rick Rescorla with helping save nearly 2,700 people that morning. Think about what that number actually means. Nearly 2,700 people who entered an office building that morning left it alive. The evacuation plan had worked. The drills had worked. The preparation that some employees once considered annoying had worked. A security officer who had spent years imagining a disaster had reached the moment every security professional hopes will never come, and he had done his job. At this point, Rick Rescorla could have left. His people were reaching safety. He was 62 years old. He had a wife waiting for him. They were supposed to leave for Italy the following day. He had already survived enough danger for several lifetimes. There was nothing left to prove, but there was still one question. Was everyone out? And for Rick Rescorla, almost everyone was not good enough. Rescorla began going back through the building with members of his security team, floor by floor, looking for anyone injured, anyone confused, anyone who had failed to evacuate. At some point, he contacted Dan Hill again. He said he was making one more sweep and intended to leave afterward. He also asked Hill to reassure Susan. Another employee, Bob Sloss, encountered Rescorla around the 10th floor shortly before the collapse. Sloss urged him to get out. Rescorla's answer was, "As soon as I make sure everyone else is out." Then he started climbing. Up. The opposite direction from safety. The same direction firefighters were going. The same direction he had moved when men needed help in Vietnam. Rick Rescorla was last seen heading upward in the South Tower. At 9:59 a.m., 56 minutes after Flight 175 struck it, the tower collapsed. Rescorla did not make it out. His remains were never recovered. Only 13 Morgan Stanley employees and consultants at the World Trade Center failed to escape safely that morning. Rick Rescorla was one of them. There is something almost uncomfortable about what happened next. The movie We Were Soldiers was released in 2002. Audiences watched the story of Ia Drang. They saw Hal Moore. They saw helicopters entering fire. They saw terrified soldiers trying to hold a perimeter against a larger enemy force. Rick Rescorla wasn't there. The actual Rick Rescorla had died only months earlier, and yet his face remained on the cover of the book that inspired the film. The forgotten officer from Ia Drang had already lived through another chapter Hollywood could never have written without being accused of making it unbelievable. A British-born soldier chooses America. He fights in one of the defining battles of early Vietnam. He becomes one of the most respected platoon leaders in his unit. He leaves war behind. He spends years preparing office workers for a disaster. Everyone hopes will never happen. The disaster comes, his people escape, and when he has the chance to escape with them, he goes back. In 2019, the United States posthumously awarded Rick Rescorla the Presidential Citizens Medal for his actions on September 11th. The official citation credited his actions with helping save nearly 2,700 lives. But perhaps the strangest part of Rick Rescorla's story is that nothing he did on that morning was really new. The location was new. The uniform was gone. The soldiers had become office workers. The jungle had become concrete and steel. But the job was the same. There were frightened people who needed someone to tell them where to go. There was danger ahead. And there was Rick Rescorla. At Ia Drang, when men were surrounded in darkness, he sang. 36 years later, inside a burning skyscraper, he sang again. Not because he wasn't afraid, not because he believed nothing could happen to him, but because other people were listening. And they needed to hear someone who sounded certain they were going to make it out. Most of them did. Rick Rescorla didn't. He once rejected the idea that men who survived a battle should be treated as its greatest heroes. The real heroes are dead. He was talking about Vietnam. He could not have known what those words would eventually mean. And millions of people know the movie that left him out. Far fewer know the man. But thousands of families are connected to his final decision, because on September 11, 2001, Rick Rescorla had already shown nearly 2,700 people the way down. Then he turned around and went back up. If you want more forgotten war stories that sound impossible but really happened, subscribe and follow us.